You're listening to Nightlight Radio Network. This is Dr. Bob Hieronimus, co-host of 21st Century Radio. We are happy to present this rebroadcast of our show on Nightlight. Well, welcome back to 21st Century Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hieronimus, and our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Kortner. Our engineer is Anita Brockington. Now, over the past 30-plus years, we focused on Bigfoot, Sasquatch, skunk apes with guests Bob Chance, Lauren Coleman, Stan Gordman, Patrick Weege, Stan Johnson, Grover Krantz, and our dear friend who now's passed on, Dr. Roy P. Mackle. And tonight's guest also has joined us on this topic, David Hatcher Childress. One program on Bigfoot that we focused on, just a survey of Maryland sightings. How many big feet, yes, they're Bigfoot, have been seen in Maryland? Well, we covered all that a long time ago in Baltimore County, Parkville, Harford Road, Carroll County, White Marsh. And maybe you remember the Bigfoot Digest. What a book. What a nice little booklet by Mark Opisosnik, which was a survey just of Maryland sightings, hundreds of them. You may even remember when in 2011, when it was claimed that I, Dr. Bob Hieronimus, a mere 5.5 feet tall, hoaxed Bigfoot when the newcomer, George Norrie actually thought that was me in a Bigfoot a uniform, if you want to call it that, walking around. That is hilarious. Fortunately, everyone realized that certainly wasn't me. And as a matter of fact, in the book that we're going to talk about tonight, it mentions there a Bob Hieronimus on page 104. That's not me. That's another Hieronimus. There are at least 4 or 5. There's at least 4 or 5 Bob Hieronymuses in the state of Maryland. And they do some very strange things that I get blamed for. David Hatcher Childress is our guest tonight, both hours. And this is his 13th appearance on 21st Century Radio over the past 30-plus years. This is the longest show of its type on the paranormal in the world. First, he joined us in 1989 and then was last with us in 2006. His book is Bigfoot Nation, The History of Sasquatch in North America, published by Adventures Unlimited Press. Longtime cryptozoology researcher David Hatcher Childress takes us on a tour of Bigfoot Nation, the apparently real world of Bigfoot around us in the United States and Canada, surviving in the shadows and suffering from loss of habitat. Bigfoot has had a huge number of encounters with humans, many of which are chronicled in this book. In these meetings, Bigfoot has been found to be curious, dangerous, and even amorous, depending on the circumstances. Whether real or imagined, the fact that Bigfoot has made his way into the psyches of Americans and Canadians cannot be denied. He appears in commercials and movies, on roadside billboards and stamps. In fact, Bigfoot is everywhere trying to maintain his lifestyle on the fringes of modern society and gently creeping into our dreams. And you can join David on this wild ride through the Bigfoot country, beginning the very first reports from the 1800s, continuing through today. His other books were Vimana, Ark of God, Technology of the Gods, Yeti, Sasquatch, and Hairy Giants, The Lost World of Cam, and Ancient Technology in Peru and Bolivia, Pirates, and the Lost Templar Feet, The Mystery of the Olmecs. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio, David Hatcher Childress.
Hey, Bob.
Oh, you're there.
I'm here. Hey. Yeah, it's great to be back on your show again.
Yes, what was it? Let's see. That was 2006. Is 12 years?
It's been a while
12 years.
Since.
Yeah.
Really, since the Ancient Aliens show has been on the History Channel.
Yeah. Yeah. Well.
And that started right around that same time.
Well, tell us about how you came to write this book, Bigfoot Nation.
I've always been fascinated with mysteries and the unexplained, paranormal. And I actually met Roger Patterson as a kid in Durango, Colorado in the mid-'60s, right before he supposedly faked the famous movie footage, film footage in 1968. And you know what? I thought, Bob, too, that when I first read that it was alleged that a guy named Bob Hieronimus had faked it with Roger Patterson in a gorilla suit, I thought it was you, too. And I thought, wow, it couldn't be, the radio Bob Hieronimus. And it was later, I realized, as other people did, that it's another guy named Bob Hieronimus, and it's not you.
Well, there are several Bob Hieronymuses in the state of one of them was caught taking underpants off of various clotheslines in the state of Maryland. So you can imagine how that was when I had to talk to other people who I don't know why he had to collect other people's underpants, but that's the way it goes. I guess maybe Bob Hieronymuses in general are very strange people. Now, so you met Richard Patterson.
Roger Patterson, yeah.
Sorry.
As a young, I was in a junior high, I guess, and I actually bought his original book after his lecture, which included audio tape of Bigfoot yelling and screaming, but this was before he had taken the famous Bluff Creek movie footage that is so famous today, and I think is authentic. But I discussed the whole idea that it was, possibly faked, and of course, I mean, it is such good footage that it is either a elaborate fake or it's real footage of Bigfoot. So I've always been interested in these things. As you know, I've written a number of books, extraterrestrial archaeology. I'm fascinated with UFOs and the moon. Ancient Aliens is a great show. It's fun being on that. I know Eric Landonican and Giorgio very well. I've known them from before the Ancient Alien show. They're both great guys. We're all very good friends. And my interests are wide-ranging. So I'm mostly known for really my books on ancient civilizations and lost cities, the ancient technology in Peru, those H-block stones and things like that.
Yeah.
But my interest also is very much also with Bigfoot and cryptozoology, the natural world. I'm a scuba diver. I love Indiana Jones, and Ivan C Sanderson was a big hero of mine.
Oh,
and he was interested in all kinds of things. You perhaps knew him, Bob.
Ivan C Sanderson, yes. I'm so glad you mentioned his name. I think he did some really marvelous work and research. Were you always interested in this? I mean, from when you were a little David Hatcher Childress, did this appeal to you then, or did it just come along gradually?
Since I was, just a young kid watching Johnny Quest cartoons and Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, and then later Man from U.N.C.L.E. and whatnot. I was a typical kid growing up in the 60s, and at that time, Bigfoot was in the news. As you remember too, TV shows were The Invaders and The Time Tunnel, and we were all geared up to that. And then Chariots of the Gods came out. That was a super hit book.
It sure was.
And it was a movie in the movie theaters. I went to see it in the early 70s. And I was probably junior high then, too, or just freshman in high school or something. You probably saw that movie at the movie theaters, too, Bob.
A couple of dozen
Chariots
times.
Of the Gods.
Yeah, sure. It certainly woke up a lot of people, and
well, it got us all going. I think the late 60s and the 70s, all this was so popular, Bigfoot and ESP, those Lobsang Rampa, Third Eye books, and all those kind of things. People were fascinated by all that. And pop music drove it as well. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Grateful Dead and all those guys. And so I was always interested in those things, and I love to travel. My parents like to travel. I was born in France, actually. My parents are Americans, but my father was a lawyer in the Army. My mother was a French major, and they took me as a little kid to Stonehenge and to the Greek ruins, and we went to Turkey as well, also down to Mexico and saw climbed the pyramids there as a little kid. So I wrote a story about Atlantis, which, having been to the Greek island Thera or Santorini, and you've probably been there, Bob, but whenever you go there, certain places, they play up Atlantis as part of their tourism thing. Santorini does that for sure, and you're drinking Atlantis wine, the local radio stations, the Atlantis radio station. And I've always been interested in those things, and I've written a number of books on Atlantis.
Yeah.
And also on ancient India and ancient Egypt, the Assyrians, Lemuria, and Mu. I've always been fascinated by all that, and I am a believer in these ancient civilizations, Vimanas. And then there's the extraterrestrial component too, the ancient astronauts and whatnot. So my wide interests cover all these things, and Bigfoot there too. And as you know, the Bigfoot bizarrely can cross over into the whole UFO and paranormal field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll get to that.
Bigfoot.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Fly UFOs and jump out of spaceships with a ray gun in his hand like a Wookiee on Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people believe that. I do talk about that in the book.
That's true, yeah. Well, let's go to Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is about 1800 to 1899. The Wild Men of the Frontier. What are the earliest reports going back to the 1800s?
With early reports really start in Canada, but also in New England, and they coincide a lot with the beginning of printing presses and newspapers. We need the press, the free press, to report these things and what's going on. So that was starting right around 1800, and that's when these earliest reports of wild men and the occasional gorilla. They didn't have the name Bigfoot then. The name for Bigfoot didn't come in till 1957, actually, in Northern California. I'll tell you that book story in a minute. But so you have these different stories of people, and the wild man is out there. In British Columbia, you actually have a cluster of people even a woman being kidnapped by Sasquatch. The word Sasquatch comes from an Indian tribe there. So it all starts just sort of seeping into the news a little bit. A wild man here, a gorilla or something there, occasionally using the word ape man. But then what happened was, get this, and I'm able to reprint this whole story in the book, that the Daily Telegraph, the Washington, D.C. newspaper, published this story on April 3rd in 1877. And it's about a wild man who's been captured in Pennsylvania, and he's being kept at the Smithsonian in a cage. He's on exhibit. It's they're having sort of centennial celebrations and things like that. And this is in Washington, D.C., this front page of the newspaper. And what the story then goes on to say is that apparently at some point he wasn't kept in this cage, and he attacked a woman and started to tear her clothes off. And then they put him back in this cage. And that the Smithsonian was exhibiting him, essentially. So here we have a story also involving the Smithsonian, which has been, it's been claimed that the Smithsonian has been involved in certain cover-ups in the past, including those Egyptian caverns and things like that in the Grand Canyon. That was also a story that appeared in 1909. Some years later, after this story, claiming that Smithsonian was doing these investigations into these caverns and what were specially man-made caves in the Grand Canyon. They had Tibetan and Egyptian type statues and swords and spears and stuff like that, mummies as well. So now back to 1877, here's a story basically saying that a captured Bigfoot is being exhibited in Washington, D.C. by the Smithsonian. But then we don't hear anything about it again. This is a real article, and I reprint the actual little microfilm shot of it. And either the Smithsonian, and there's other stories as well of in the 1800s of Bigfoot being captured, young Bigfoot. So it's either a hoax by the newspaper just making this up, or else they had a Bigfoot on exhibit and somehow took it off exhibit. And now the Smithsonian, their own records would somehow show this. And this, in a sense, is the beginnings of what I suspect is something of a cover-up about the existence of Bigfoot.
Well, there certainly are other researchers that have been saying for the past decade that Smithsonian has, whenever they come across some of these very large bodies or bones of bodies and things of that nature, somehow trash them, take them out into the ocean and throw them away. Do you know anything about that?
Well, people are often talking and asking about, where's the evidence for Bigfoot, and wouldn't the government have found one by now, in the Army? And then there's some interesting stories about that, to say the least. So then we have also the chapter then about the first Bigfoot photo.
Let's take a pause here because we need a break right here, and then we'll come back to that. This is David Hatcher, Childress, Bigfoot Nation, History of Sasquatch in North America, Adventures Unlimited Press. We'll be right back after this.
Hi, I'm Glenn Kreisberg, author of Spirits in Stone and co-founder of the Overlook Mountain Center in Woodstock, New York, overlookmountain.org, and you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus. Keep listening.
We are back and returning now to our guest. Now, David, you were just getting ready to launch us into another area. What was that?
Yeah, Bob, the whole issue of photos of Bigfoot. And what I started in my research for this book, and I did a book on Yetis and Sasquatch prior to this one as well, is looking for all the photos and images I could find, and there's a lot more than you would think. I've probably got the most photos of Bigfoot ever in collected in any book, and I had to pay for a number of them, and which is fine. One of the most interesting, and I have as a chapter in the book as the oldest known Bigfoot photo, was a photo that was taken in 1894 in Lillooet, British Columbia. This is sort of west central British Columbia. It's a town full of salmon. The Hudson Bay Company has big offices there. And this photo was taken of one of five, and it's in my book, and I printed in quite high quality in the color section as well. Although it was a black and white photo, it was photography was just really beginning there. It would really be hard for there really to be a photo of Bigfoot. They would be older than say 1880 or something. But here's one from 1894. It was kept secret for years in their offices. That's what the guy who he sent it to some Bigfoot researchers, and eventually Janet and Colin Board got a hold of it, republished it in one of their books in a reprint, and my buddy Lauren Coleman put it, and Craig Woolheater, they put it on their Crypto Mundo site, but so it's in my book. The photo is a very clear daytime photo. It's of a dead Bigfoot, and he's in the snow. It's a large foot photo. There's a pair of snowshoes that are part of the picture. There's some kind of building and a bunch of trees in the background.
Yeah.
It's a Bigfoot dead on the ground. He's covered with fur. He's got very furry hands. And it's either an elaborate hoax or this is a clear daylight photo of a Bigfoot. And literally, it was kept secret by the Hudson Bay Company. And a guy who knew about it, this is the story, he snuck in, and they allegedly had 5 photos. We only really have this one. And he stole it from the Hudson Bay Company. This was like in the 1920s, and then kept it in the family, and then he finally sent it away. So it's astonishing, really, that we would even have a photo this old, and it's a clear photo. We didn't really get any more photos of Bigfoot until the late 40s. There was a photo of Bigfoot that's in my book as well, that was sent to a guy in Denver named Joe Fex. But then it wasn't until Patterson in the 60s that we started getting more photos. And I talk about this in the book, Bob, how the evidence that we really had, and this is what Grover Krantz, of course, is such an expert on, was the footprints. And it was in 1958 really that a guy, he was a bulldoze operator named Jerry Crew, and he was up in the Bluff Creek area of Northern California. This is near the Oregon border. It's where Roger Patterson eventually went to as well. But in 1958, Jerry Crew was with a crew putting in a road through that area, and it's super rugged. There's very few little towns around there. This is all west of Mount Shasta. There's not really, in this part of California, the nearest big towns are actually in Oregon. But it's heavy forest. It gets a lot of rain there. There's an Indian reservation nearby there called the Hoopa Indian Reservation. Those people are very well versed in Sasquatch. And what happened was Jerry Crew then, one day, he would come back to his bulldozer on this muddy logging road that he was cutting east to west across this remote part of California. And he would come back in the morning onto this muddy road to his bulldozer, driving four-wheel drive up this road, from wherever town he was staying in. And he would come back to his bulldozer, and he would see these big footprints in the mud, very clear, human-like footprints with the toes and everything, but they were gigantically huge. And he was stunned by it. He'd never really heard about this before. He began coming. It was going on for days. And finally, he came back with plaster of Paris, and he became really, in a sense, the first guy to really do this. And he took plaster of Paris casts of these Bigfoot molds around his bulldozer, and then he went to the local newspaper in, Redding, California, which was still quite a bit south of Mount Shasta even. And he showed that to them, and he said, look, I'm finding these giant footprints. I don't know who's making them, what's going on. It's baffling me. And the newspaper asked him, they said, well, who do you think is making these giant footprints around your bulldozer? And he said, well, I guess I would call him Bigfoot. And that's how the name Bigfoot started. Up till then, we didn't have, in the United States, in Canada, they were calling him Sasquatch. And the giants and the hairy wild men, the ape men. But now the word Bigfoot entered our lexicon. And as you were saying from the back of my book, it's everywhere today. Bigfoot is a giant marketing vehicle. He's making millions of dollars. Everyone knows about Bigfoot and who Bigfoot is, what he's about, whether they might have some opinion whether he's real or not. But he's everywhere, and ultimately, in the last 50 years, he's come so much into our consciousness. And in my mind, Bob, Bigfoot's out there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree with you. I believe in my opinion, there has been a cover-up on this, and it's gone for a long time. I also I guess this is not a photo, but of drawing of Jacko the ape boy.
Right. Jacko is, and Ivan C Sanderson first wrote about that in his book, Abominable Snowmen, Legend Come to Life. And that was a story also from the 1800s. There's no photos of Jacko, but he's a very similar story to the 1877 Bigfoot that was captured in Pennsylvania and allegedly exhibited in Washington, D.C. by the Smithsonian. Jacko was found by railway workers in British Columbia. It was the 1860s, and he was a young Bigfoot. British Columbia is a hotbed of Bigfoot activity. There's certain areas there that even today where there's just so much Bigfoot, and oftentimes it's near Indian reservations. Native Americans pretty much accept Bigfoot, and they've known about them for hundreds and hundreds of years. And they live largely in harmony with Bigfoot. They totally accept that he's around, and they respect him. There's an interesting story along those lines of a Hoopa Indian woman who lived by herself, as most of them do up there. This is also in the Bluff Creek area, near to where Jerry Crew found the footprints, near to where Roger Patterson took his famous footage, although it wasn't actually taken by Roger. It was taken by a guy named Bob Gimblin. But she said, and I have this in the book, and my book goes really chronologically, year by year, talking about significant Bigfoot sightings for each year. And as we get closer to our own time, there's literally sightings virtually every year. Back in the 40s and 50s, we didn't really collect sightings for all those years. This was a woman near Hoopa Reservation, and she claimed that Bigfoot was coming up to her house. She lived by herself, and that one day she finally met Bigfoot, and he walked up to the she had like a little small fence and gate in front of her modest little cottage where she lived. It was like 9 p.m. She had already seen Bigfoot, and he just walked up to her, and he stood in front of her, and she stood there at the door of her house looking at him, and she wasn't afraid. Most people are extremely afraid when they see Bigfoot. I mean, it's the most frightening thing that's ever happened to you. It's one of the things that I found out the most in interviewing people about Bigfoot, which is, what I've really done. I've not had that many real experiences myself. I'm interviewing. She was not afraid, and she tried to speak to Bigfoot.
Yeah, she did.
But he would not speak. He just looked at her. He had nothing to say, and then he walked away without harming her. Bigfoot doesn't speak. He makes whistling noises. They make a kind of a chattering noise. They make screams and growls. They're afraid of fire. But it was interesting that she tried to speak to him, and he just looked at her, and they walked away. So it's interesting. There's many stories, too, of Bigfoot. He's not so much afraid of women. There's interesting stories of solitary women, older women who, often widows or something, who live kind of remote places, also in the Midwest, and they have maybe an orchard. And so there's a famous story in Illinois where the woman, she had an orchard, and she would see Bigfoot coming to her orchard from her back porch, and he would look at her, and she would look at him, and he would take apples from her orchard, and she developed a relationship with him where she wasn't really so afraid and had seen him a number of times, and he began, she said, to leave dead rabbits for her as a present for the apples that he was taking from her orchard. And there was another almost identical story out of Georgia where a similar thing was happening, where a woman owned a peach orchard and developed this kind of friendly relationship, in a sense, with Bigfoot, who in these cases is curious. He's that's one thing you can say about Bigfoot. He's curious about humans. He knows now to stay away. In some ways, they're interested. That's why I keep talking about Bigfoot Nation. He's watching, and from the shadows, he's there at lonely little highway.
We have a little tape here on one of the sounds that Bigfoot allegedly makes. Let's take a listen to that. Okay. All right. So here we have Bigfoot grunting. We had another one, didn't we, Lars? Let's play. All right, so there we have him singing. Thank you very much, Lars. All right. I don't know if you heard me when I was talking there, did you?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I heard the Bigfoot howling there in the distance. Bigfoot is often outside in the woods. There's even a journal that's been published called Wood Knocks. He makes a knocking sound. We have him out here in the mountains of eastern Arizona, where he's known as the Mogollon Monster. And we have the Mogollon Rim. Arizona is a large state, and much of the south and southwest is desert. But the eastern parts of Arizona are mountain areas, thick forests, the ski areas and stuff like that. The White Mountain Apache Reservation is in that area. And there's many stories of Bigfoot, what we call the Mogollon Monster. And he screams at night. There's a lot of camping in this area, but there's not many towns. Payson or Snowflake or Heber. These are some of the few towns in this huge remote area. It's also where Travis Walton was picked up by that UFO. Has he been on your show, Bob?
Oh, sure, a couple of times. But we need to take one more break, the last one of this hour, with our guest David Hatcher Childress, Bigfoot Nation, History of Sasquatch in North America, Adventures Unlimited Press.
This is Travis Walton, the author of Fire in the Sky and the subject of the movie by the same name. And you're listening to 21st Century Radio, hosted by Dr. Bob Hieronimus.
Thank you. Let's get right back to our guest. What about, Rudy, we got to get going. Chapter 4 is about 1900 to 1949. What are the reports from that particular time?
Well, we have the famous report of Albert Osman, who was kidnapped, supposedly. It is a famous story, and Ivan C Sanderson tells that. We have also the stories of, and there's, of course, a number in the book, and one good photo, the stories of Mount St. Helens. And it turns out that Mount St. Helens itself is a hotbed of area. Mount St. Helens is in Oregon, famously blew up in 1982 or something. And the early reports were that also in the 1800s, when this British explorer went into that area, and the Indian tribes told him, they said, don't go near Mount St. Helens. It's got these hairy giants, and they're cannibals and stuff. It's very dangerous. And he tried to get them to take him there and pay guides, and they refused to take him into that area. And Mount St. Helens area has never been really populated, and there's only just small little tourist towns and stuff like that there. So you have a famous Mount St. Helens attack where they, in a place called Ape Canyon, that was in the 1920s. In that story, there was like 3 prospectors who had gone into the Mount St. Helens area, and they had encountered Bigfoot. They were armed with rifles and whatnot, fought with Bigfoot. Bigfoot at night attacked them. They had built a cabin. Several Bigfoot jumped on the roof of the cabin, and they famously had this big kind of overnight shootout with with several Bigfoot and several guys, and in the end they were scared, and when daylight came, they finally left and took off, and it was in the Oregon newspapers and things like that. The Albert Ostman story is a curious one because we had an earlier story that I talk about in the book, which is from the late 1800s, of a woman in British Columbia, and she claims that she was kidnapped by Sasquatch, taken to a remote valley. She was held there for a year where they kept her fed, she said, and then brought her back to her remote village where she was not exactly starving, but was quite sick. And the story is, I tell in the book, and comes from well-known Canadian stories, that she then gave birth that night as she came back, but it was stillborn, and it was, in this case, a half Bigfoot, half human type of baby. In this case, it was dead. In theory, people can have a Bigfoot human child. Orangutans and chimpanzees are also, their chromosomes are very similar to ours. Certainly stories of Yetis and of Bigfoot are that Bigfoot is interested in humans. He's a kind of a missing link. He has a sexual attraction to human females and young ones. And in this case, it was a woman. She was, basically kidnapped. There's a famous Yeti story like that in Nepal, which I write about in my book on Yetis, hairy giants, Sasquatch and hairy giants, which that book came out in 2005. The Albert Ostman one is a curious story because it's where he's kidnapped by a Bigfoot family to be as a husband for this Bigfoot woman. And his story is that he was a prospector in a remote area of western British Columbia. That area is still remote today. That's a heavy Sasquatch area, and Canadians know it well. Sasquatch is a big deal up in Canada, just like Bigfoot is down here in the United States. And but he was kidnapped. He was by himself. He was supposedly taken in his sleeping bag over these mountains. He was thrown over the shoulder in the middle of the night by a big Bigfoot and then taken to Box Canyon, where he was kept captive. And his story was that he was there for this lonely female teenage Bigfoot who was part of the family, and there was a young kid there too. There was like a mom, a dad Bigfoot. He was kidnapped by the dad, and then there was this female Bigfoot, and then like a younger male. And he still, because he had been taken in his sleeping bag, he still had a few supplies with him, like a big stick of tobacco and stuff. And he claims that, when he tried to leave, they were friendly to him and they fed him and stuff. But they wanted him to stay and be part of the family. That was his claim. This was all in the 1920s, remote part of British Columbia. He escaped in the end, and they became curious about this plug of tobacco that he had. The Bigfoot ate some of it, made him sick, and then this guy was basically able to escape. His is a famous story and told in a lot of Bigfoot books, I admit, including Grover Kranz's, and even Ivan C Sanderson talks about it. But it's interesting here, this sexual attraction that Bigfoot seems to have with people. In these stories, Bigfoot is very much a human missing link type animal. He eats, he has sex, he's a hairy critter. He doesn't have, they don't have fire. They don't have the vocal cords that we have. They're incredibly powerful. It's the world of Bigfoot, and it's right out there on the fringes of our society. I'm convinced that Bigfoot's really like coyotes. He's in every state. He's in Maryland. He's in Rhode Island. He's out there in Pennsylvania and North Carolina and down into the swamps of Florida and the Southwest. He's in the cornfields. He's up in northern Michigan. He's in California. He's in New Mexico and in Texas. It's amazing the stories of Bigfoot, how many there are all the incredible tales. I couldn't even put them all in my book.
I was also curious. It was always curious to learn about the older Bigfoots that are generally white, having a very rough time in their last years. Could you talk a little bit about that in the time we have left in this hour?
Yeah, right, Bob. Sure. And I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, the Rogue Bigfoot. The stories began surfacing in the 60s and 70s and 80s of truck drivers throughout the United States and Canada reporting, particularly back when CB radio stuff was popular and all those convoys, and truckers would call into radio stations and stuff like that. And they would see this, oftentimes a very large, tall, white-haired Bigfoot, probably a male. Again, him being snow white hair, like some kind of Yeti poster or something.
Yeah.
But he is apparently some older Bigfoot who's getting quite old. He's gray-haired, white-haired now. As other animals do, this happens to lions and things like that. You're older male, you're no longer a dominant male, and you're forced out of this tribe or whatever you've been living in, and these older white males, they become rogues. They're cast out of wherever they're this cluster of Bigfoot that they're living with. And
we got to stop now. It's the end of the hour, and we come back. We'll continue our talk about the older Bigfoots and also go into the year 1950 to 1999. Cases on Bigfoot with David Hatcher Childress and Bigfoot Nation. Well, welcome back to 21st Century Radio. Our guest is David Hatcher Childress. Bigfoot Nation, The History of Sasquatch in North America, Adventures Unlimited Press. This is a fantastic book, friends. Are you with us again, David?
Yeah, Bob, I'm here.
All right. Now, let's move into Chapter 5, about 1950 to 1999, which you say is the heydays. What are the reports like from this time?
The heyday of Bigfoot, and that was an article in our magazine, World Explorer, which you mentioned earlier. And we have a lot of cryptozoology stories and Bigfoot news. It comes out 3 times a year. And I call that the heyday years, really starting in the 50s with Jerry Crew finding the footprints and coining the term Bigfoot, the news media jumping on it. And then ultimately, then it was Roger Patterson in the same area where Jerry Crew had originally found the big footprints around his bulldozer. This is the Bluff Creek area of Northern California, right near the Oregon border. And so it was October 20th, 1967, when Roger Patterson, he had a 16-millimeter camera with him. He was with a friend named Bob Gimlin, who's still alive. I just saw him at an Alien Con in Pasadena in July. That was great to see him. He's still out there. Roger Patterson died in the 70s. He took the footage. He's credited with that. He didn't have the copyright for that. For some reason, a Canadian guy named Rene DeHinden, he owned the copyright to that footage. But it's the famous footage. They suddenly saw this Bigfoot. It's a female Bigfoot. A lot of people don't realize that. There's been some suggestion that there was a male there, and he was actually shot and killed. I don't know if that's the case, but I was told that by somebody once. In the movie footage, and then so all those and the photos are in the book. The female Bigfoot is walking in the daylight through these trees along this creek, and turns, looks at the camera, turns back, keeps walking, and you see her breasts. It's a female. She has a certain way of walking too that's unusual, and her back foot comes up very high, to the point where you can actually see the bottom of the foot very clearly. And those are frames in the video that are very important, and I include them in the book because you can really see the bottom of her foot very clearly. That footage is so famous from 1967, and it's been shown over and over again. You can go on YouTube and watch it. It's either extremely good hoaxing of a Bigfoot, and it's somebody in a Bigfoot costume or in a gorilla costume. That's what it would have to be if it's not really Bigfoot. And that's where there is one book that came out. It was called The Hoaxing of Bigfoot, and I have it. I discussed it in the book. And that's where they say that a guy named Bob Hieronimus dressed up in a gorilla suit and went with them to Bluff Creek, California, and he wore the gorilla suit and pretended to be a female Bigfoot. And this is something that I talk about in the book, and we know it's not you, Bob. You're a different Bob Hieronimus. We talked about that earlier. And I don't know, this was a Bob Hieronimus from Washington State, I believe. And back in 1967, I don't know how old you were back then, but we know it's not you. But but here was the curious thing, was that they're actually claiming that not only is this an elaborate hoax, but for some reason, these elaborate hoaxsters decided to hoax a female Bigfoot. Now, why would you do that? That just makes your hoax more elaborate and more difficult to do. And Carl Flock and these guys who are writing this book, because it has to be a hoax. I mean, it's either real or it's a hoax. It's not a bear. This is part of the story too, and you get this with Yetis, by the way, Bob. What the naysayers are basically saying about Bigfoot and the many, many claims up in Canada and I would say in areas of Washington and Oregon and Northern California where Bigfoot is so well known that, I mean, people, just general population actually does kind of believe in it. Definitely up in British Columbia and Canada, I would say the majority of Canadians do believe in Bigfoot, Sasquatch. But it has to be either a hoax or it's the real deal. And for all these stories to be hoaxes, it just doesn't make sense. But what they're saying then is is that it's a bear. People are looking at bears, and that's what Reinhard Messner, the famous Austrian mountain climber who solo climbed Mount Everest by himself without oxygen. He's probably the most famous high mountaineer climber in the world. I myself was a technical climber in the Himalayas, and I follow mountaineering, and I've spent a lot of time actually in the Himalayas and in Nepal, Tibet as well. He wrote a book called The Quest for the Yeti, and his book is an interesting one, and I discuss it more in my Yeti book rather than Bigfoot Nation. But in the end, even though he gives us some pretty, I thought, fascinating stories of Yetis that were pretty strange, and I repeat them in my Yeti book, but he concluded in the end that Yetis were bears, and that people were just mistaking a bear, a Himalayan brown bear, that is standing on its two legs and kind of threatening you on the trail or something, for this giant hairy ape man, which is the Yeti, which is what we would call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. So here's the skeptics. They're basically saying, okay, we've got these stories of people who think they've seen a Bigfoot. They've had some kind of encounter with a giant. I mean, you know, this thing's 9 feet tall. It's 10 feet tall. It's covered with hair. It's roaring. It's scaring, you know, everything out of you. But what you're really seeing is a bear. You're seeing a bear that's standing up on its two legs. It's scaring you, and you're just mistaken. You don't know a bear when you see one. And bears do stand on two legs, and they will walk forward you like a man, but they can only do that for a short distance. And as we all know, bears are running around on their forelegs normally. But it's absolutely true that bears stand up on two legs. But the idea that all of these reports of Yetis and Bigfoot and Sasquatch are really mistaken reports of people encountering bears is ridiculous. And I mean, basically, what they're saying is that it's all hoaxes, and people's just oddball encounters with bears where they don't realize they're seeing a bear. Well, let me tell you, most of these people, rangers and other types, who are hiking in the woods, myself included, and now, well, when we get into the photos and the footprints, that's actually different. They know a bear when they see one. They know they're not encountering a bear, and in fact, they know it's really some kind of a gorilla. This brings me another point, Bob, to bring up, which is a very good one. People are often ask me a very good question, and it's an extremely reasonable one to ask. They say, "Well, look, if Bigfoot is really out there and running around and he's eating cattails and he's eating frogs and he's eating geese, they kill deer and they eat them. They eat all kinds of stuff. Why aren't we seeing dead ones? Why don't you discover we see a dead, or the ranger doesn't see some dead Bigfoot, by the side of the trail or something like that? We would, rangers and stuff like that would encounter them. Well, that's not really true. It's a good point to make and a good question to ask, but it's wrong. If you're walking down the woods, and I've spent a lot of time hiking all over the West and whatnot, you will never see a dead bear on the side of the road trail. You'll never see a dead mountain lion out there. You'll never encounter that, even though we know mountain lions and bears are out there. You're not going to see a dead one. They go to some remote area, little Box Canyon or wherever, and die, and then they're gone within a few days. Just the carrion birds and whatnot, they're gone. You're not going to see those things. So the idea that you would see a dead Bigfoot just lying there. Now, some hit by cars, as we started to talk to about the break, and there are a lot of stories of that, and I talk about them in my book, where people are driving down the road. That's a very common story. They're driving down the road, and Bigfoot suddenly runs in front of them, crosses the road, and in Washington State or Oregon, it can be in Michigan, all over the place. It can be right there in Maryland. So it's a very common story. And there are stories of Bigfoot being hit by cars and whatnot. So he's out there. These white-haired Bigfoot that are often seen by truck drivers and near towns, they become these rogue Bigfoot. They're this is what I theorize. They are less afraid of going to human towns and villages. They become dumpster diving. They're heading around highways and truck stops, areas that normal Bigfoot would probably avoid that. But they've been cast out of society, and they're roaming around. I have all kinds of reports of this in my book of people in remote areas all over the country, New Mexico and whatnot, where they're seeing literally Bigfoot hanging out under a streetlight near a dumpster in this, some remote town near an Indian reservation in New Mexico or something. So these are typical, Bob.
Well, I really did appreciate one area of your book when you talked about I believe his name is Ivan Marks, the hoaxer.
Right, Ivan Marks. Now,
well, look, we won't have enough time to get to him yet because we're coming upon a break. So,
okay.
But I wanted to say I want to get into this when we come back, and that mainly because I had him on, and I
wondered if you ever had him. Yeah, okay, is that right? So,
yeah, and I was very unhappy about the whole situation. That was 20-some years ago. But I really appreciated your analysis of his work and how you went about it, which showed to me an extreme amount of care in trying to weed out what was going on in that particular situation. Because
that's right, yeah, and he had that oddball movie, Legend of Bigfoot, and which is fascinating to watch.
Yeah. Just about fascinating.
It's a gas, yeah.
Well, time out here on the playing field, and as a matter of fact, we have time out to present to you a Pennsylvania recording of Bigfoot screaming. Oops. Oh, we already did it. Do it again. Here we go with Bigfoot screaming in Pennsylvania.
were looking at a set of tracks newly made in the fresh snow. And they'd passed so close to our shoulder that the thing must have known we were there. They weren't the tracks of a bear or an ape, but more like a splay-footed naked foot. The tracks of the abominable snowman.
Oh, excuse me. Got carried away there. Right. Our guest is David Hatcher Childress, Bigfoot Nation, History of Sasquatch in North America. And we were just touching a little bit on a hoaxer by the name of Ivan Marks, which we had on 21st Century Radio many years ago, 20-some years ago or something. And I just could not believe this man after that particular conversation. Would you like to say anything about Ivan Marks before we go into 1950 to 1999?
Right. Well, I'd like to hear your just story about him briefly. But yeah, he was famous for doing some Bigfoot hoaxes and a movie in particular. He got involved with really genuine Bigfoot material, what they called the Bossberg Cripple, and some handprints too with Grover Krantz. Talked about that. He was involved with Grover, and he probably talked about that on your show. And that was in like 72, early 70s. But he then produced this fake video movie that was like shown at elk clubs, and it was one of those back in the 70s and 60s elks clubs and colleges and high schools would sometimes have these sort of wild kingdom type documentaries that were sort of homespun, oftentimes 16 millimeter films or something oftentimes they were hunting or something, some strange adventure, and Marx's movie came out 77, I think, and called Legend of Bigfoot, and it was like a 90-minute film where he goes all over finding Bigfoot, shooting pictures of Bigfoot taking showers or washing himself in streams and things. He goes up to Canada and does it, but most of the film is really like a big hoax, really, and kind of laughable when you watch it. And I mean, it's funny to see. And I'd be interested, what he said on your show when you talked to him.
Well, I did not believe the photo of the Bigfoot taking a shower. For some reason, it just seemed to me that if anything could easily be hoaxed, that's what I thought could be hoaxed. And of course, as you said, within your analysis of him, he was out to make money. That was the key. That was his concern, wasn't it?
Well, certainly later on. I mean, I think, and he knew Roger Patterson. I never knew Ivan Marks or talked to him, and you've talked to Grover, I think.
Sure.
I think that a lot of these guys, including Rene Dahinden, who ultimately owned the copyright to the Patterson footage, he's dead now, but he lived for many years by charging for the use of any of those photos or the film footage. So a lot of these guys, including Ivan Marks, realized, hey, there was some money to be made. I can't say any of them ever got rich, writing a Bigfoot or faking Bigfoot things. In Ivan Marks's case, yeah, he's a little bit of a stigma on Bigfoot research because most of these guys are sincere. And even Ivan Marks, I believe, was sincere originally, but in the end, he was trying to cash in, and he made that film. It's worth watching just as for a few laughs, ultimately.
Yeah, I agree, but I just like the way you analyzed it, and another from the standpoint as to credibility. You didn't attack him. You didn't attack him on emotional things and things like that. That's your work is outstanding in the area of credibility. You work towards that, and your reputation is very good.
Well, thank you for that, Bob, and I appreciate that. in all these cases with Bigfoot, ancient aliens, Atlantis, crop circles, different paranormal things, there's something to all of it in my mind, but there are hoaxes. There are people out there who will lie and pretend that they've had experiences when it would seem that they really haven't. Sometimes people believe in strange things and that things have happened to them, and they honestly believe it, but evidence shows that didn't happen. I think that's, what people like you and I are doing, and all your listeners, and this whole big audience out there who watch Ancient Aliens. We're all thinkers. We're scientific. We're knowledgeable. You can't really be into these subjects, in my mind, without really, being a pretty smart person and having a lot of interest in many things, and including science and whatnot. See, we're looking at this, and we want the evidence. We want to see what's real. I'm not just going to believe in anything because it's strange or weird, but many strange and weird things, as you know, are true.
Mm-hmm.
We live in an incredible universe and a fantastic world full of all kinds of amazing things happening to everybody all the time.
Well, another...
Many of the claims, are to be doubted, shall we say.
Well, I'm used to being doubted and everything, especially here on the East Coast. On the West Coast, I'm not being doubted.
I think, when it comes to Bigfoot, and I'm more of a West Coast person and a Pacific Northwest. I went to high school in Missoula, Montana, we all saw Seattle as sort of our, the big city and whatnot, and Seattle's a great place. My brother actually lives in Seattle now, works for Boeing. But in the Pacific Northwest, and definitely very much in Western Canada, the subject of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and whatnot is a more normal subject than it would be on the East Coast, and even in the Midwest, where people are just like, well, Bigfoot, can he really be out there running around in these, creeks and gullies and things like that? It's interesting to think of the Midwest that way. Our main office for Adventures Unlimited and the World Explorers Club is actually in a small town south of Chicago called Kempton, and we're out there in the cornfields. We're actually away from the major rivers in Illinois. But let me tell you, I'm not from the Midwest at all. I'm really from Colorado and Montana, and now I live in Arizona. But I also live in Illinois, and I was surprised that, Illinois and Iowa and Indiana and Mississippi, all these places, Missouri, they have their Bigfoot stories too. There's a lot of them.
Yeah.
Around a town called Seneca, Illinois, is also one of these areas where Bigfoot gets a special name. There he's called the Seneca DuPont Monster, after the DuPont Dynamite chemical company. Mm-hmm. And it's because near Seneca, Illinois, is this DuPont Dynamite area that's been there for years. It's along the Illinois River. It's a huge wooded area and all the area around it is also remote farmlands. There's one little town that has a marina called Seneca, Illinois, but the rest is quite wilderness area there, heavy bushes and things. Once you get away from the river, you do start to get farms with cornfields and soybean fields and stuff. But that area is a hotbed of Bigfoot activity. It was in the news in 2005 where there's a Lover's Lane in that area, and people, they all know about Bigfoot there. I mean, to the point where he has his own special name. And this Lover's Lane, it's got in the Chicago newspapers. It became such a big deal. This couple are there making out in the back seat and whatnot, and suddenly Bigfoot's there looking in the window going, hey, what's going on? And it's 1 o'clock in the morning. I've been to this spot, and it's an area where people see Bigfoot a lot, and it's right near this DuPont dynamite factory. And as part of the thing, they have to keep dynamite in these remote bunkers, and so it's a private woods where rather than say a national forest or something like that. But Bigfoot is there, looking in the window, going, "Hey, what's happening?" And he was apparently brought there just by the smell of sex, in a sense. And he's there wanting to know what's happening. And the woman totally freaked out. Immediately they jumped up. I mean, this is totally out of some 1950s, a horror movie or something, where Bigfoot, the boogeyman, is interrupting, some teenage couple who are making out. And they go to the police. And I mean, she insists on making a report about Bigfoot, and it gets in the Chicago Tribune, which is, they're not normally going to be running some stories about Bigfoot. So I went there to investigate it a couple of years later, and they were all like, "Oh, yeah, we know about Bigfoot here." And I found I was surprised at just how common Bigfoot stories were, particularly in that area, and how the people in that town, they basically all accepted the idea that Bigfoot was out there. They joke, Bob, that coyotes are in every state in the continental U.S. They're right there, in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. They're there in Rhode Island and Maryland and Connecticut. You name it. There's some coyote. And it's like a Bigfoot's there, too. He's curious. He stays on the fringes of civilization. It behooves him to sort of go dumpster diving and check things out. They're curious, too, about us. I mean, we fascinate them. But, yeah, they remain secret from us. They know not to expose themselves, although they're still seen. More and more we're getting photographs of Bigfoot, and it's because people are carrying cameras with them all the time.
Yeah.
Also, people are buying these nature cams now, and they've been on the market only for about 10 years or something. And people put them out in their backyards in Kentucky and other places, thinking they're going to get some cute pictures of raccoons and whatnot coming onto their backwoods property. And, you buy them from National Geographic or these things, and they just take these automatic cameras photos at night and stuff, and people are actually getting pictures of Bigfoot and stuff. And in one case, like in Kentucky, they called the local rangers and stuff and said, "Hey, I got a picture. My trail cam took a picture of a gorilla in my backyard. Is there do we have gorillas out here?" And the forest rangers are saying, "Oh no, we don't know what you're talking about." So here you go.
Well,
and I put those photos in the book.
One of the other things I enjoyed, and we're coming upon another break here in a couple of minutes, but Bigfoot, does he have any pets or animal friends? Could you talk a little bit about that for a minute or two?
Yes, right. I'm glad you brought that up, and that's a fascinating part about Bigfoot. As I doing this book, was finding that there were these interesting cases of Bigfoot having sometimes a dog or what was perhaps a wolf with him. Like that Bigfoot had some pets in some cases. I particularly, as I was pouring through all the different accounts, whenever I would see that, I was like, okay, I was looking for unusual things like that. Bigfoot also associated with UFOs and things. I talk a little bit about that in the book, but there's not so much. There's the famous account in Minerva, Ohio, which was in 1978, and they made like a local movie just recently because it's one of the more unusual Bigfoot encounters. It went on over a series of nights in Minerva, Ohio, and they were looking at, it was a very tall Bigfoot, over 10 feet. He had been seen, it was a rural community around a bunch of farms, and eventually a bunch of people finally stood and they saw this Bigfoot standing there across this field for them. And just looking at them, you have occasionally, and it's a typical thing, a stare down of a sort. It usually doesn't last too long, of you and Bigfoot, and off across a field or something. And Bigfoot, in this case, had two black cats, black panthers on either side of him. So that was an unusual encounter.
I'll say.
Where, here's Bigfoot with, say, some cougars, black cougars in this case. That's pretty strange, and that that's perhaps something that you would call a cult in a way. We don't really have black panthers in the upper North America. We have cougars. We do have big cats. They're not normally black. Black panthers do exist in Central America, I believe, and South America and whatnot. So that's pretty interesting. There are other reports of Bigfoot having dogs or what is perhaps a wolf, and you would think that they had taken them as you would as a little puppy and raised them as a pet. So that's an unusual thing. Sometimes also Bigfoot's carrying something, a big stick or a club is often. He's sometimes been seen wearing like kind of an oddball vest, or like he's put somebody's old jacket on, something like that. Those are often oddball reports rather than just the naked, hairy Bigfoot that we think of, who's 8 or 9 feet tall or something.
We're upon our last break of the hour, and when we return, you have several Bigfoot accounts that include UFOs. Let's touch on a couple of those when we return.
Hi, this is Lauren Coleman, author of The Field Guide to Bigfoot and Cryptozoology A to Z. You're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus.
And we're back. I'm Dr. Bob Hieronimus, and you're listening to 21st Century Radio. Learn more about us at www.21stcenturyradio.com. There are Bigfoot accounts that include UFOs. For example, on page 153, you review a September 1989 account in, I think it's called Tillamook, Oregon. Could you tell us about that experience?
Yeah, sure, Bob. I talk about a few unusual accounts in the book where Bigfoot is seen around UFOs and flying saucers and things. In that story was from September of 1989, near a rural area near Tillamook, Oregon. And the woman, she was with her granddaughter, and she heard a noise, she stepped out of her house, and then she saw this UFO that was hovering like a flying top just above the ground, and it had a flat bottom and bright yellow-white light shining on both ends of the craft. And then she walked towards it, and she got within about 30 feet of the craft, and then a door opened, she said, on the craft, revealing a blonde human-type person with fair skin and average height and blue eyes, looking kind of like a Nordic, normal human, blonde. And they were wearing silver overalls. And then she noticed that from a window next to the door, there was this big, hairy, Bigfoot-type creature that was sitting there in a chair and was only visible from the chest up. And she looked at this, and she was just, totally astounded. There was this flying saucer with what seemed to be a Bigfoot sitting in it in a chair. Now, whether this Bigfoot was, like, piloting the craft, I kind of doubt that myself. But there's other stories in there, too. And, in fact, another one is that it's from the summer of that same year, 1989. And this was in Sedona, Arizona, famous for all of its interdimensional, new agey stuff. And this person then was taking a hike, and they looked up and they saw what they thought was this, seemed like an interdimensional type doorway. Up and you have these red rock cliffs that are around there, and that there was a person standing there, and that guarding them, it seemed like, was two Bigfoot creatures that were like sitting there, and it's standing near this window. Well, they were like 9 foot, and kind of standing there, again, almost like bodyguards or something like that. Yeah, we have with Star Wars this popular concept of Chewbacca and him being this spaceship piloting, ray gun toting Bigfoot Wookiee. I mean, he's kind of clearly very much a Bigfoot character. He doesn't really talk. He growls and kind of makes these noises, although he's pretty smart. You wonder how smart Bigfoot can really be, and the whole idea that Bigfoot himself is flying saucers through the universe, jumping out with his ray gun, and like in Star Wars, it's a little bit hard for me to quite access. And I wonder if instead it's something like where Bigfoot is some kind of bodyguard, genetically engineered, used to protect people. There's a very strange story that also comes from Mount St. Helens, which is, we talked about this earlier. Mount St. Helens is known to be a heavy concentrated area of Bigfoot activity. When Mount St. Helens blew up in the early 80s, it sent this pyroclastic flow of super hot gases down the mountain, and it set entire forests on fire and instantly incinerated all of these animals, including humans too. But all these bears and deer and whatnot were also instantly incinerated, thousands of animals over a wide area. And certain witnesses claim they saw later the U.S. Army landing at certain parts of Mount St. Helens with helicopters, and that what was happening was that there were all these dead animals who had been instantly incinerated by the pyroclastic flow from the volcanic explosion, and that some of the dead animals were Bigfoot. And people witnessed then the Army taking dead Bigfoot and putting them on helicopters and flying them away. That's an amazing story, and that even someone would like just make that up is pretty fantastic. They're imaginative, but it kind of makes sense. And you would think that something like this did happen. And if that's the case, if the U.S. Army actually had dead Bigfoot, it would, according to this story, that's basically what they had. What would they do with that? Well, they've got the ability to clone Bigfoot. Now we're looking at some Hollywood Halloween horror movie where the U.S. Army is cloning Bigfoot, looking for their super soldier. Bigfoot's, this Bigfoot's got an implant in the back of his brain and some antenna. They've somehow figured out how to control Bigfoot and turn him on and off. He might be a good sergeant of arms to, jump out of flying saucers, first. I don't know. Your show, you've had lots of, interesting guests with some pretty alarming statements and stuff like that. I don't know that this is really the case, what I'm saying right now, but let me tell you, it's quite possible.
Well, I've been reading a lot of other research material, and one thing that popped into my hands 20 years ago was a book called The Raw Material.
Okay, right. Yeah, I'm sort of familiar with those books. Yeah.
I am so glad you are. Because everybody else I talk to about this doubts that it even exists. But of course,
yeah, there's a series of those books. There's like 4 or 5 volumes.
Yeah, and
they do talk about Bigfoot in those books.
Oh, yes. Basically, they come out and say that Bigfoot comes from Mars.
Okay, is that what they say in there? Okay,
yeah.
The Bigfoot's from Mars. That's interesting. Okay.
Isn't that something? And but also they...
And they load him up with seeds and things, and isn't that part of it?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, also, they review a lot about it, what they were created for. And they allegedly were created for if our DNA goes, then they'll use the DNA of them to continue human-like beings. Now, that's I have no way of being able to attach myself to believing this, but I have enjoyed other aspects of what the raw material talk about, and then I've found is substantially correct. But this is an area that is very peculiar because so much right now is going on the internet, and I'm sure you're well aware of what's happening in regards to Mars from the standpoint of not only thinking about our returning to it, but the fact that there have been suggestions going all the way back to 1962 when we discussed this particular project dealing. It was actually something from England. I'm trying to remember the name of it, but it's not coming right now. And that basically indicated or suggested that we arrived on Mars in 1962, and one of the first things they saw, and there was a movie called Alternative 3. And we had, obviously, I've seen it a number of times. I'm sure you have too.
Yeah, I've seen that.
And of course, in that movie, it shows one little segment in which they are looking out at Mars and they see a creature, a small creature, moving along under the ground. So then they claim that there is life on Mars, allegedly.
Yeah, they're like some worms or something, big Martian worms under the surface, if I remember correctly.
Yes, that's correct. And also, what are some of the? If you go up to the internet right now, you got to be really careful up there. But there are photographs and films that are going on all the time in regards to Mars, showing you things that are on Mars. Now, have you seen any of those?
Well, of course, and I think the idea that Bigfoot is from Mars is a curious one. Most people would think that Mars did hold life in the past, but it's more of a desert planet and has been drying up, and that life on Mars is probably, is struggling, but there's still life on Mars. That Bigfoot is from Mars, I would say, it would be from a Mars of the ancient past that was quite different from today.
For certain.
And
yes.
we know that, anyway, Bigfoot stories go back hundreds of years, for sure. There's no question about that.
What's been the most surprising thing to you in regards to all this research on Bigfoot, Sasquatch, etc.?
Well, I think what's interesting is that Bigfoot really is everywhere. He tries to keep out of the limelight as much as he can, but he's reported constantly, monthly, weekly. Now, because of the internet and smartphones, and everyone's carrying a camera, and we're all reporting. We're all reporters now, and we've all got our own web pages, and I think people aren't so much afraid to say that they've seen Bigfoot or that something weird happened to them. In the past, that was more of a factor where people didn't want to seem gullible or seem weird, and people are more open to the idea that, I had this strange experience. I saw Bigfoot, the other night.
Well, we about out of time right here. I want to thank you, David, for joining us again, and hope you can come on our show again the next time. Next book you come out with, Bigfoot Nation, The History of Sasquatch in North America. Get a copy. Get a couple of copies. You'll love it. And that's the end of the hour. 21st Century Radio is produced by Hieronimus and Company, and our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Kortner. I'm Dr. Bob Hieronimus, and remember to get a haircut.